Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. For those who do not know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans, and I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for almost 25 years. I started during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and a raging panic disorder that had blown up into agoraphobia. I was on disability, I was unable to leave my house, and happened to get paired up with a psychologist who even back in 1998 was already several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation. And this is what he offered me as a way of dealing with what I was going through. I was not impressed with his suggestion. My feeling was, I can't work, I can't go out, I can't do anything. My life is stopped. And here's this guy talking about watching the breathing and stuff. I'm like, huh? It was all he gave me. And I figured, well, I'm sitting at home panicking all day anyway. So I'll give this a shot just long enough. I can honestly go back to him and say, look, dude, this didn't work. Can I have the real treatment now? As I say, this was almost 25 years ago, and I never had that conversation with him. I'm still practicing. I'm teaching. My entire life changed. So I'm ready to admit there might be something to this practice. And here I am. And thank you for being with me. So today we're going to talk about karma. That little thing. We'll cover some of what it is, some of what it isn't. And I want to start off by revisiting for a moment what we talked about last month in our previous online session, which was my introductory Mindfulness 101, Am I Doing This Right session. And in that session, I talk about why. Why are we practicing mindfulness, insight, meditation? What is this stuff for? Are we practicing it for its own sake? No. We practice for a reason. We have an intention for our practice. And you're going to hear me talk about intention an awful lot today. Our intention is to decrease our suffering. Now, this is the term that the Buddha used. Much of what I study, what I teach, comes from the teachings of the historical Buddha, as best we know them, as they've been passed around the world and over the course of 2,500 years through oral and written traditions, right? The Buddha taught, and all he taught, was how do we decrease our own suffering. A teacher that I read and quote an awful lot, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, likes to use the word stress instead of suffering. It's easy to romanticize suffering, or we might think about suffering as just this, oh my God, like Sisyphus trying to get the rock up the mountain or something. When we talk about suffering, we don't mean just that kind of awful experience. We're talking about everyday stress. We're talking about stress here. We're trying to improve our day-to-day experience. Now, how are we going to do this? We develop clear seeing. We are practicing mindfulness and insight meditation in the interest of developing clear seeing. Now, how do we develop clear seeing? By experimenting with cause and effect. We're setting causes and conditions for effects to arise. And we're seeing what effects arise. This is karma. This is karma. The Buddha took a very scientific approach. We make a change, we see what happens. Based on what happens, we decide what to do next. That's another cause and condition, based on the effect from the previous one. So that effect is now a cause for our change. And we see what the next effect is. Karma is not what we think of in this Western sense, this bastardized version of karma that we've turned it into, where it's this justice and revenge-based thing. What goes around comes around, and he's going to get his in the end, and that whole kind of thing. It's not this cosmic justice. I find it much more useful to think of karma in a very day-to-day sense. And I'm going to go through several main points about karma, using an example that is very familiar to me and might be familiar to you as well. This is something that I call the inner and outer cycles of dread. Okay? Let's talk about the inner cycle. Suppose we have some kind of event coming up that we are not particularly looking forward to. I myself have a dentist appointment this Monday morning. So I got one right there. Now, when we have some kind of an event like this, something that may be imminent, something that may be off in the future, something that may never actually happen. Well, I know for me, I very quickly jump to picturing this worst case scenario about it. So in this case, I'm in the dentist chair and they've got like 50 tools in my mouth and there's these people looking like, holy shit, what's wrong with that guy, right? And as a result of picturing this nightmare scenario, my body starts to go through a number of changes, right? Because our subconscious mind and our bodies don't know the difference between an actual crisis that's happening and one that we're just picturing is happening. So if I'm picturing this worst case scenario, generally in an attempt to be prepared for this worst case scenario, right? My body is responding as if it's actually happening. So now my body's all keyed up. And what does a keyed up body do but key up the mind further? Say, oh, there really is an emergency here. So now we've formed this feedback loop between the mind and the body, generating this crisis, right? We're triggering our own fight or flight reaction. And this in itself is unpleasant. And so what do we do with it? Well, we try to get rid of it. We try to calm it down. Well, how do we try to calm it down? By picturing the worst case scenario again to see, am I going to be okay? And we try to convince ourselves, well, we'll be okay. So we really create this cycle of misery. That's the inner cycle of dread. Now, the really nasty one, as if that one's not bad enough, the really nasty one is the outer cycle. This is the one where maybe the event never happens. Maybe the event does happen, but it wasn't so bad. Maybe the event did happen, really was bad, but still, we got through it, right? We're still here. This is the cycle that sees that the thing didn't happen or we got through the thing. But we got through it after engaging in all of that obsessive misery-based thinking. And we're like, oh, wait a minute. It must have worked. I did all that nasty shit, but then I got through the actual thing. It worked. I'm okay now. Better keep doing that. We build this association in our mind between this hell we're putting ourselves through and the elation afterwards for having gotten through the thing. It's like a superstition, right? I better keep doing that to make sure I get through it again. So that's that outer cycle that keeps us doing the inner cycle every time some kind of unpleasant anticipation comes up. Interestingly, this association between the self-generated misery and then the successful completion afterwards, that association is one of correlation, not causation, as they'll say in any statistics class, right? There's a correlation, not a causation. But what we're talking about here in the world of karma is causation. Okay? And what is the cause and effect relationship here? Well, over time, engaging in this inner dread cycle becomes our default process. Because we're like, well, that worked, got to keep doing it. And for those of you familiar with neuroplasticity, which I talk about quite a bit, the way our brain physically rewires itself based on our thought patterns. I think of them as mental highways. So these are the patterns that we are creating for ourselves at a physical level. And over time, we simply identify with those processes as who we are. Well, I'm a person who does this. We may not consciously think of it that way, but it becomes a part of how we identify ourselves. This is what I do. This is why I do it. And this becomes what the Buddha might have called, in terms of karma, a limiting potential. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Before we get to that, I want to talk about the hallmarks of karma and how they relate to the example that I just gave. I mentioned Thanissaro Bhikkhu a few moments ago. Here's something that he says about the Buddha's teachings on karma. He says, skillfulness. And when we talk about skillfulness in Buddhism, we're talking about, like I said earlier, we're decreasing our own stress and suffering. So skillful thinking, skillful action, skillful speech. When we talk about these are things that decrease our stress and suffering. Skillfulness depended not so much on the physical performance of an act as on the mental qualities of perception, attention, and intention that played a part in it. Of these three qualities, the intention formed the essence of the act, as it constituted the decision to act, while attention and perception informed it. Well, what's our intention, our central pillar of karma, in this inner and outer cycle of dread? Oh, when we boil it down, we're trying to achieve total certainty. Certainty of how things are going to play out, but primarily certainty of, am I going to be okay? Like me with my dentist appointment on Monday. Am I going to be okay? Am I going to experience pain? Is there going to be bad news, right? Trying to achieve total certainty, if not necessarily of what will happen, then at least that we'll be prepared for the worst. We're trying to rationalize or avoid some kind of a felt experience. This never works. Our emotional systems are much older than our intellectual systems. So they always override. So this is not a skillful endeavor. This does not decrease our stress and suffering. It increases our stress and suffering. But the next component after intention is attention. And if our attention is not directed towards seeing that this is actually increasing our stress and suffering, we're not catching the cycle as it's happening. And if we're not catching the cycle as it's happening, well, that leads us to the third pillar, the one of perception, which in this case would be continuing to fall for this illusion that we cling to, that maybe it'll work this time. Maybe engaging in this thought process this time will help me feel better and calm me down and make it so I don't have to experience that felt sense of fear, of anxiety, of dread. So we have an intention that is not skillful. It's well intended. Of course, we don't want to feel pain or feel, right? But it's not skillful. It's not working. It's not giving us the results that we want it to, that we think it could, we think it should. And we're not paying the attention to see that. And so we continue to cling to a misperception and we repeat the process. So it's not that the effects don't matter, because the effects matter, but the intention is the most critical component for the quality of our own experience. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about karma, is the quality of our own experience right now. And like I say, the intention is what's really key here. For example, if you are walking down the street and you see somebody you don't like, and you go and you shove them because you don't like them, that's a negative karmic experience because of the mindset where that is coming from. Regardless of the effect, you're not in a pleasant place and you're not doing much to change that. Now, that's a very different thing than if you had gone up to that person and deliberately shoved them because you saw a car coming that was going to hit them and you shoved them out of the way. Same action. And again, the effect is not what really matters. Regardless of whether you successfully get them out of the way of the car or don't, the karmic imprint is the same because of the intention behind the action. We can't control outcomes, but we can control which intentions we act upon. And in my experience, that intention, as I like to think of it, infuses the mind. Even before the action has made it out into the world, as you know, once we take that action, regardless of the external effect, we are already experiencing increased or decreased stress and suffering based upon it. That's karma. This is the immediacy of karma. There's a collection of Buddhist teachings called the Dhammapada. The very first sutra in it indicates that mind precedes all phenomena. Now, this is a deep statement that we don't have time to get into fully here, but our experience is generated by what we are bringing to it. Right? We are not passive recipients of our experience. We bring something to our experience based on our memories, experiences, decisions, actions, fears, desires. Right? And the Buddha himself talked about the immediacy of karma. He says, if with an impure mind, and here when we say impure, we're talking about unclear seeing, not taking it from a moralistic standpoint necessarily, simply talking about, are we seeing clearly? For example, the cycles of dread, okay? Are we seeing these cycles clearly, or are we running on the hamster wheel that they're creating, right? If with an impure mind, if with unclear seeing, we speak or act, then suffering will follow like the wheel that follows the foot of the ox. You imagine this ox drudging through the mud, carrying, whatever the hell they've got them hooked up to. And that muddy wheel right behind the hoof, right? Karma's that fast. In fact, he follows that by saying, if with a pure mind, if with clear seeing, a person speaks or acts, then happiness follows like a never departing shadow. That's pretty immediate. So we often think of karma as something that's going to happen later, something that's coming down the road. I don't think of it that way. I'm not saying it doesn't include that, but I don't find that anywhere near as helpful as recognizing that my karma is playing out right now. We're creating our experience here and now, and have been laying the foundation for this present experience in the past as well as now. Our present and future, but I like to think primarily of the present, our present karma. Again, whether we are experiencing increased or decreased suffering, is based on our past and present actions and intentions. Okay? As I was talking about neuroplasticity before, our previous thought patterns, and when I talk about thought patterns, let's take the 3 pillars of karma: intention, attention, and perception. Thought patterns. Our previous thought patterns are old karma. They're causes and conditions. We are now living the effects of them. They have created the ground for our current experience. We are engaging in life on intention that is on autopilot because of our habits, our neuroplasticity, right? That I mentioned earlier. For example, at that first thought of something unpleasant, we may immediately start to engage in those cycles of dread. Why? Because we've done it over and over and over again. That's karma. Again, not karma in some kind of judgy, moralistic, cosmic, simple cause and effect. Simple cause and effect. Habit. A habit is an effect based on the cause of engaging with a particular pattern again and again till it becomes automatic, right? And that brings me back to what I was talking about earlier about this limited field of potentials. Okay? The Buddha had this great analogy or metaphor where he said, karma is like a field. And our consciousness, our awareness is a seed. And our desires or intentions are the water that nourish the seed that's been planted in the field. Now, what's going to grow there is going to depend upon the quality, the amount of the water that represents our intention, but is also heavily going to depend upon the quality of the soil in the field that represents the karma, our old karma. What we can grow is limited by that. As I was just describing about how we become limited by the causes and conditions that we have placed that maybe haven't been so skillful and have led to the kinds of effects that I've described. And we start to constrict how skillfully we can proceed. Another way that I like to think of it is, I mention this as an example a lot of the time. I find it really helpful to visualize this. When we were kids, if you remember, that we'd have these books where there'd be like a picture and then there was like a sort of translucent sheet of colored paper, like it'd be yellow, and you'd put it down over the picture, and now everything has like this yellow hue over it. And then there'd be another colored sheet, and it would be like green, and you could layer that on top, and then it would change the way it had all these layers. You could just keep layering on colors of translucent paper, and we keep looking at this image through ever-changing colors depending on which layers we've put on. We're coloring our current experience through this lens of our past thoughts, intentions, actions, mind states. So we're quite literally not seeing the picture clearly. This is what we peel back in this practice. So our past karma has created our conditioning, to use a more psychological term for it, right? And we can't change our past karma, but we can affect our current and future karma by changing conditions. We've created this conditioning. We can create new conditions, right? Because unskillful intent doesn't come from nowhere. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It leads to suffering. It also comes from suffering. It comes from suffering. Like the examples of the cycles of dread or shoving somebody that you don't like. So ill intent is a perpetuation. It comes from stress and suffering and leads to more. It's another cycle, right? So it's a perpetuation. And where there's perpetuation, well, that implies there is a perpetuator. Who do you suppose that might be, right? So that leads us to my final point, which is, as I mentioned a moment ago, we can affect our current and future karma by changing our conditions. How do we do that? Well, we can set an intention to clearly see, to comprehend our role as the perpetuator. Again, not in a sense of judgy, blaming, more, nothing. We're just talking cause and effect. We're scientists, okay? Seeing our role in these karmic cycles. Our karma is on us. Okay? We're using our awareness, our attention, right? As well as mindfulness. And as I mentioned in our session last month, mindfulness here does not mean awareness, as we often are told in this culture that, oh, mindfulness is just awareness. No, mindfulness is a function of memory. We are holding something in mind. Noticing what we are setting as causes and conditions, seeing how it's working out, and keeping in mind what works and what doesn't. Our memory of what is skillful informs our attention and our perception, which serves to inform our intention. I often like to think of it as using our hands to untangle cords. Like, you know, using your earbuds. If you don't have Bluetooth earbuds, you're plugging them in old school and they, you know, inevitably get all tangled up. This is this unraveling, this untangling. It requires attention. It requires feedback. Oh, does it go through this way? Is this working? Or am I making it more tangled? Same thing from a mental standpoint. Now, the really nice thing here is simply by having the intention to make a change, you're already starting to expand that constricted field of potentials that I mentioned earlier, because you're making a change. It's a skillful change. That intention in itself, it's not the whole thing, but it is something in and of itself. That is a new cause. That is a new condition that will lead to some kind of different effect. So simply forming the intention to notice this, you've already started. And using awareness and our mindfulness to pay attention to unskillful processes, unskillful intentions, like these cycles of dread, bringing attention to the unskillful processes short circuits the perpetuation of them. Because the perpetuation isn't something that's just happening. Again, it feels like it is to us because it's on autopilot out of habit, but we are the perpetuator. But we can't perpetuate the cycle and truly observe the cycle at the same time. We can go back and forth real quick. Don't get me wrong. It can feel like we're doing both of them at the same time. But in any given moment, we can only be doing one or the other. So if we're observing the cycle, if we're observing our intention, in that moment, we are not perpetuating the cycle. We are not engaging in it. Which means we've set a different cause and condition, and in that moment have a different effect, a better effect, an effect with, if even just for an instant, less stress and suffering. My friends, that's karma. That's karma. In closing, we'll practice in a moment. I've run a little longer than I intended to, but that happens. Happens a lot. This is a much more optimistic take on karma than, again, this bastardized Western version of karma that we have about all this justice and revenge. And karma is our responsibility. We can't generate somebody else's karma. We are not responsible for somebody else's karma. But we can shape ours. And we can do it right now. And if we forget to do it in this instant, we have an opportunity to do it in the next instant, and the next, and the next, and the next. And I really liked the words that the Buddha chose in that quote I mentioned earlier from the Dhammapada, where he said, if with unclear seeing we carry out in speech, action, and so forth, suffering will follow like the wheel follows the foot of the ox, that ox dragging through the mud, right? But if with clear seeing we act, happiness follows like a shadow. And, well, what do you need to cast a shadow? Light. Right? Let's sit for a few minutes. If you have your camera on, you're welcome to leave it on for the sitting. You can turn it off if you prefer. I'll be leaving mine on. And the one cue I always like to give before we begin is, if you are sitting, to have your hips elevated higher than your knees if possible, which is optimal for your posture as well as your breathing. If that's not possible at the moment, not a federal offense, something to keep in mind for next time perhaps. I always like to begin by imagining that I am suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of my head, as a nice cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. I always like to say that if we are experiencing some tension right now, mentally, physically, that's quite all right. To put it karmically, we often have an intention to try to stamp out any tension that we're feeling. And how do we stamp out tension? Well, we try to force it away. And what does force require? Well, force requires more tension. So we bring tension to the tension to try to get rid of the tension. Huh? And if we don't inform that intention with attention and perception, seeing that it doesn't work that way, well, we keep engaging in it and adding on more and more layers of tension, right? So this right here is an example of changing our intention, changing what we're doing, changing the causes and conditions, and simply allowing the effects to play out and see how they do. So if there is tension here, we can form the intention to see what it does when we let it be. It may not necessarily leave. But we are not adding more tension to it. This is a perfect example of not adding stress and suffering to a level of discomfort that may already be here. So if we are having an experience of discomfort, we are not adding an experience of stress and suffering on top of it. That's our karma playing out right now. What kind of experience we are creating for ourselves. Now, we may also, as we often do in this practice, form an intention to bring our attention to our breathing and to perceive what it's like, how it feels, what the quality of the breathing is. Again, not quality in terms of is it good, is it bad? Quality in terms of is it long? Is it short? Is it deep? Is it shallow? And we may notice that based on the qualities that we perceive, we may form an intention to try to change those qualities. Based on what we are bringing to our experience. For example, perhaps the thought that, well, I'm meditating, so my breathing has to be long and deep and contemplative, right? So I'm going to make it like that. That's a thought. That's a storyline. That's a concept that we have brought to our experience that has informed our intention in a certain way. And now perhaps we are making ourselves miserable trying to force breathing to fit into that conception. We do not have to force the breathing, bring tension to the breathing for the breathing to be the process that it is. I invite you to try out the intention of bringing attention to the breathing and perceiving it exactly as it is. Our meditative breath is simply the breath that is happening as we are meditating. If we set that cause, that condition, what's the effect? One of the effects that we may notice when we are trying to bring all of our attention to the breathing is that lots of other things arise. Usually thoughts. And what intention do we often bring based on our past experience, on our past conceptions, on what we've heard? What intention do we often bring? Well, I shouldn't be thinking, I need to stop. In my experience, that's an unskillful intention. Causes stress and suffering. After all, I need to stop thinking is a thought in itself. So how's this going to work then? So perhaps we bring some attention to that and recognize, oh, perhaps a different intention is in order here. Perhaps simply an intention to bring attention to the fact that thoughts are arising. Perceiving them as they arise. Perhaps as a mental picture, perhaps as a sound, perhaps as a felt sense in the body. Noticing that they arise, that they change, that they pass. Noticing that we don't just have thoughts arising, but we have thoughts about thoughts arising. For example, the thought of, I shouldn't be having thoughts, right? Letting our attention and perception inform our intention, what we're going to try next. And being mindful of what's working and what's not working, based on our levels of stress and suffering. Can we form an intention to simply observe that? In the course of today's talk, I've mentioned several cycles. Some skillful, some not so much. One of the most powerful cycles that I've found is simply forming the intention to bring attention to my intentions. So I may more clearly perceive those intentions, where they're coming from. What they're looking to accomplish. Are they coming from a good place? Not so good place. Because wherever they're coming from, that's what they're going to bring more of. For myself, for me. Maybe sometime later, but definitely right now. Because again, it's a mind state. What kind of experience do I want to create for myself right now? And if I focus on the right now, the later will take care of itself. I don't even have to worry about the later. Because all later is a right now that hasn't happened yet. So if I'm taking care of right now, I'm good. I'll close today's sitting with a short passage that I wrote a number of years ago that dovetails nicely with the Buddha's metaphor about the field, the seed, the water. We plant the seeds of our own suffering and nurture their growth. Such seeds can only bear bitter fruit, whose own seeds start the cycle anew. In our attempt to be okay, we ironically cultivate a garden of misery. That is karma. It's not off in the future. It's the way we experience our lives right now as a result of our own intentions and actions, including how we use thought. It's not cosmic justice. It's basic cause and effect. It's less what goes around comes around, and more, if we do what we've always done, we get what we've always gotten. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, comments, observations of what might have come up. Hey, Barbara.
Hey there. Just wanted to say hello and thank you so much for your generosity in sharing all of this information. It's very, very helpful and so skillfully done, Ron. Beautiful. Thank you.
Cheers, Barbara. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. As most of you know, this is near and dear stuff to me. I mean, my life is the way my life is because of this practice. When I hit bottom back in the day, that in itself was the result of years of causes and conditions that I had put in place, right? That was my karma, right? I had not dealt with pain and fear skillfully and didn't want to go through the discomfort of making the necessary changes to alleviate what I was going through because it hadn't gotten bad enough yet, right? Let's wait till it gets really bad, then work on making the change, right? As I often like to say, we humans, we always do the right thing after we've exhausted all other options. So this was my way out, setting new causes and conditions and having better effects. And it's near and dear to me. So anything that I can do to help other people, whether it's something, like I say, it doesn't have to be something cataclysmic in your life. It could be a life-stopping event like mine was, or it could just be, work stress or something. It doesn't matter. We all experience some kind of stress and suffering. No one's immune. So anything I can do to give back, it's an opportunity that I'm grateful for. So thank you for that. And thank you for being here. That goes for everyone. Cheers. Carol, how you doing?
I'm good. I have kind of a two-part question.
I'll allow it.
So in your example with the dentist, is it your intention to change your perception about how the dentist will be? Changes your karma? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is completely different scenario. Let's say a friend did something to upset you to the point where you're questioning the friendship. So while you were talking, and it was connected to communications, obviously. So while you were talking, it occurred to me that maybe the reason that they treated me that way is their perception of my communications towards them felt bad. And my perception is the same thing in reverse. So I'm just trying to figure out how to set a different intention or how to kind of repair that situation, even if it's only within my own perception.
Great questions. I'm going to take the second one first, just because it's fresher. We'll come back to the first one, which was really interesting the way you phrased it, by the way. Simply by engaging in the kind of thought process that you are engaging in, which is to say, having the openness and the awareness to recognize what the other person's perception might be, that in itself changes the causes and conditions for what could go forward. Because, much of the happy horseshit we see out in the world today is because people don't even do that, right? One of the things that I like to say sometimes is how other people handle their business is their business, or their karma in this case. How we handle how other people handle their business is our business. So how your friend may have handled things is on your friend. How you handle it is on you. And the way that it sounds like you are handling it is to recognize that there may be a miscommunication here. And so then based on that, and that's a form of clear seeing. Based on that clear seeing, what intention do we want to form? What might be skillful? And again, skillful in the sense of increasing or decreasing suffering. So in some cases, if it was something horribly egregious, perhaps the most skillful thing is, well, you don't see this person anymore. It doesn't sound like that's something that is this situation, but as an example, we have to go with the situation as it is. So if it's something that extreme, we might form one intention and act upon that. In this case, it may be a matter of, oh, hey, I noticed this and I was wondering if perhaps you perceived something I said as that, and that's not what, because we've all been there. We've all been there. It's another example of how we're not passive recipients of our experience. We bring something to every experience. So you can say something to one person and say the exact same thing the exact same way to another person and get two crazy different reactions. I'll give you an example because it's really germane here. A number of years ago, this was probably 15 years ago now, my day job in IT, somebody had come into my cubicle because there was something something had gone sideways somewhere, some such, and someone from one of the other teams came into my cube, and we were talking about something, and I was asking him if there was something going on in his area, and just trying to rule out what the source of this issue might be. And we had a quick chat, and when I realized that, this was nothing that would have involved him and what he worked on, I said to him very casually, "Okay, no worries, dismissed." I get called into my boss's office about a half hour later. And my boss is, Joe is pissed at you. And I'm like, really? Why? Like, we've been friends for years. And he said, you were talking about this thing, and then you said dismissed. I said, well, yeah, I said that. And then I thought a moment, I was like, was Joe in the military? And my boss is like, yeah, I think he was a Marine or some such. I'm like, God damn. I didn't even think of that. When I say dismissed, I'm not a military guy. Anyone could take a look at me and be like, that guy's not going to make it in the military. I say dismissed, I'm thinking like when you're a kid and the class dismissed and everybody's happy and they get to leave and you're off the hook. That's what I meant, was like, yeah, oh, okay, we're good. You're off the hook. I have this issue. Clearly, it doesn't involve you in any way. You're good to go. I meant it jovially. He took it, because of his background, quite naturally took it as I was dismissing him. Get the hell out of my, right? It's not that one of us was right and one of us was wrong. We were both coming at it with completely different experiences, completely different perceptions of this word. And so clearly there was a hell of a miscommunication there. I felt terrible. I called Joe over right after. It's like, holy shit, dude, I'm wicked sorry. Like, I didn't even think, and we smoothed it out and we never had an issue again. Kind of a long answer, but I felt like that's a germane. Let me just stop there and we'll come back to the other one. Does that help?
Yes. Yeah, it does.
Okay, great. So what I really liked and what I found really interesting about your first question was, you said, is there an intention with relation to the dentist and so forth? Is there an intention to change our perception? Now, that's an interesting one. When I think of perception, I don't think of it as something that we are attempting to necessarily change or having an intention to change. I think of it more as we're having the intention to perceive things as they are, clearly. And when I say things as they are, everything's a process. So not noticing it as some static thing, but noticing the arising, the passing, the changing, causes and conditions, and how they lead to effects, and those effects become causes and conditions for next effects and so forth. So I think of it as not an intention to change our perception. I do think of it more as using our perception of whether our current intentions and the actions we're taking upon them are working or not. So in the case of the dentist, I get that frozen mental, and I see it right now, by the way, because I'm talking about it. I'm seeing it as I'm talking about it. Me in the chair with, all kinds of crazy shit in my mouth, and the doctor just in there like, and perceiving that I am focusing my attention on this frozen mental image, this nightmare scenario, and perceiving how that is making my stomach lurch, making my heart rate jump a little bit. I slightly catch my breath. And then perceiving how there is an attempt to eradicate those sensations of discomfort and bringing attention to the process that I'm engaging in, and an attempt and an intention to accomplish that, which historically for me has been engaging in those cycles of dread. And by bringing attention to that process and how I am generating it, my role in it, I can now perceive my own role in it and see that not only is it not accomplishing what I'm intending for it to accomplish, it's actually making things worse right now, and is making things worse in the future because I am perpetuating, calcifying this cycle, making it ever more habitual. That's what I'm perceiving. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you for that. That was a fascinating twist. That question, are we bringing an intention to change our perception? That was interesting. That was I've never gotten that question before. And that was never even quite thought about it that way before. So that was really interesting. Cheers for that. Thank you. Folks, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to see you all again. Looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Ron.
Cheers, everyone.